Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Actually, good afternoon and good morning and good evening. Welcome to Project Europe's first fireside chat of 2024. And before we get into our conversation, I would like to thank you for joining us and for supporting the Irregular Warfare Initiative. As you know, our mission has been from the get-go to bridge the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare. Within this broader mission, the IWI Project Europe focuses on European security issues to deter and defend and improve resilience against irregular and hybrid threats. Our guest today is General David Petraeus, and obviously a gentleman who needs no introduction. A few of his past assignments include Commander of the International Security Assistance Force, Commander U.S. Forces Afghanistan, 10th Commander U.S. Central Command, Commanding General Multinational Force Iraq, and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Our conversation today will be pivoted around General Petraeus's book, co-authored with Sir Andrew Roberts, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. With that being said, I will invite my co-director, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Fazio, to get us started.
Hey, thank you, Olga. And I also want to thank you, General Petraeus, for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. I also want to recognize that you dedicated this book to U.S. coalition diplomats, spies, and development experts that you served alongside. And then at the end, in the acknowledgments, yes, sir, also very generously donate the profits of this book to organizations that support men and women in uniform, veterans, and their families. So thank you very much for that. Before we get into the ideas presented and how they apply to Europe and irregular warfare, I want to first ask you, what is the purpose of this book, its overarching goal, and the message you hope readers take from it?
Well, the goal was to provide the military historical context for Ukraine. That's what Andrew Roberts pitched to me when he called me up, and having written 19 books already, none of them with a co-author, but he said he felt that there needed to be, that was a gap, and would I be willing to co-author it with him and focus in particular, needless to say, on the two wars that I was privileged to command at the very highest level, Iraq and Afghanistan, very much irregular warfare. And then also Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation. And also, again, should have been much more of an irregular warfare campaign. We finally got to that after about 13 years, but we pursued it as a large war in many respects, almost a conventional campaign in various regards. So, and I feel reasonably good about having done that for, again, the situation in Ukraine. And of course, now in the next edition, which we'll be doing this summer, the second edition, we'll also add a chapter on Gaza and what's going on in the Middle East. And then the big takeaway really is about the critical importance of strategic leadership. So that's literally at the very highest levels. It's the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, the prime minister of the UK, what have you. But then pretty quickly, once the very fundamental decisions at that level are made, it devolves to the commander of the theater of war, say the commander of the multinational force Iraq or ISAF/US forces in Afghanistan. And there are four tasks of a strategic leader. The first being far and away the most important. That is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy, having a deep understanding of your forces, of the enemy forces, of all the other elements in society, the ethnic groups, sectarian groupings, the political parties, tribes, other elements of society, how the country is supposed to work, how it really works, the neighborhood, the physical terrain, the human terrain, all of this, and then craft the right strategy. And that is by no means the case in many of the wars that we visit, the conflicts. As I noted already, it took us all from the mid-1950s to 1968, late in 1968, to finally recognize that what we should have is a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign rather than search and destroy, a battle, war of attrition, big units, and all the rest of that, which clearly was not working. And in the case of Afghanistan, it took us 9 years to get the inputs right. That's not just the big ideas and the strategy. It's also the right organizational architecture, almost the right level of forces, the right leaders, the right preparation of forces, material, all the other aspects that are so important. So this is not a given. The fact is that the surge that mattered most in Iraq was not the additional 25 or 30,000 US forces. It was the surge of ideas in which we completely reversed the big ideas, completely reversed the strategy from what we'd been doing, given that that had been invalidated by the alarming rise in violence that had Iraq virtually in a Sunni Shia civil war in large parts of the country, including the capital. So you got to get the big ideas right. As we quote Clausewitz in one of the chapters at the beginning, the most important task of a commander is to understand the nature of the war in which he is engaging, not trying to make it what he wants it to be, but rather, again, recognizing it for what it is. And that is absolutely crucial. Then, having gotten the big ideas right, the strategic leader has to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization, every different means possible, and everybody else who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict, which includes, in my case, is America's mothers and fathers. It includes number 10 Downing Street, the White House, others, our Iraqi leadership counterparts, and on and on and on. And then to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, that's the third task. This is attracting the best and brightest, hanging on to them, getting the organizational architecture right. That doesn't hit you on the head like Newton's apple fully formed if you sit under the right tree. You have to play with it, work it. They're all one-offs in these kinds of wars. You have to get the metrics right to determine whether you're winning or losing, making progress or experiencing setbacks, and they have to be very granular and detailed and ratcheted down. You have to allow those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's how you spend your time is crucial. It's the example you provide, the energy, the inspiration. But again, a lot of it is your battle rhythm. It is the meetings that you have. That's the way you drive the implementation of a campaign plan. And among those meetings have to be those that enable you to or force you to perform the fourth task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how the big ideas need to be refined as the context evolves, the situation changes, you learn, and so forth. And so we had a number of events that would, again, enable me to tap into, say, the lessons learned teams from the Army, the Marine Corps, the Joint Forces, Counterinsurgency Center, Asymmetric Warfare Group, all of these, or with the strategic planners once a week that required me to make decisions. If boss, if we want to be here 6 months from now, you have to make a decision today that is going to head us in that, get us headed in that direction. And then repeating the process again and again and again. This is the intellectual construct that I developed in that same period. So again, I had 6 consecutive commands as a general officer to close out my career in uniform. 5 of those were in combat. The one non-combat one was the one when we did the counterinsurgency field manual, overhauled all aspect of officer, commission, warrant, non-commissioned officer professional development, the mission rehearsal exercise in the National Training Center, material requirements, all of this, including the development of the counterinsurgency field manual, but also for myself, again, distilled this intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership, and then actually used it explicitly to think through my duties and responsibilities, what I needed to do as a strategic leader to meet my responsibilities as effectively as I could. I used it obviously also at Central Command, Afghanistan, CIA, and even in this position, I'm a partner in one of the world's largest investment firms, KKR. We manage about $550 billion and own over 120 companies and have minority interests in another 100. And some of those companies actually have 100 or more companies of their own. You look at Axel Springer, which you will know in Europe, and all the different elements that it has there. So that really, I think, is the biggest of the big ideas. It's the biggest of the takeaways. And it's the prism through which, or the construct through which, you can look at each of the conflicts. And that's what we do, because it's generally the quality of the strategic leadership that determines whether or not that side prevails or not. I'll note that every leader actually performs these 4 tasks. The difference is that they perform them within the decisions that have been made, the confines, the intent, et cetera, that has been developed by the strategic leader. And that's why that first task for the strategic leader is absolutely imperative that you get that right. We've seen repeatedly, again, think of Dien Bien Phu when the French are frustrated in Indochina that the Vietnamese won't come to fight. And so they create this big base out at the edge of their air power, surrounded by mountains, all kinds of invalidated assumptions that they made. But they would finally bring the Vietnamese, the communists, to battle. And did they ever? And of course, it was a seriously bad idea, and it led to their withdrawal, defeat at Dien Bien Phu, and ultimately an agreement that partitioned North and South Vietnam, but also led to the French withdrawal from their former colonial empire out there. And many other examples of this, but also some where we got it absolutely right, such as, say, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and you can walk your way through that. And we can do the same thing with respect to, say, Ukraine, President Zelensky's strategic leadership versus President Putin's, and then actually of their subordinate military commanders. And unfortunately, of course, the Russians have begun to learn a reasonable amount, and that's particularly worrisome at this point in time.
No, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And just to recap here, the framework, the intellectual framework which you are proposing in this book is really understand, communicate, implement, and refine. It is not dissimilar to things like John Boyd's OODA loop, or at a more tactical level, the F3EA, but it is applied to a more strategic level. And it seems like there is this element of humility in applying that cycle. What other kind of characteristics does a leader need to have in order to successfully implement that cycle?
Well, the most important quality, I think, for senior leaders, but especially the strategic leader, is essentially operational or strategic judgment. I can, tolerate a lot of other things. People used to ask, especially during the surge in Iraq, what do you look for in these 3 stars? What are you looking for in the multinational core Iraq commander? Is it somebody who can run with you? Does he have to have a high and tight? Does he? And, again, look at the 2 MNCI commanders that we were privileged to have, Generals Odierno and now, of course, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. I mean, neither of those could run with me on their best day. Actually, Lloyd could when he was a brigade commander at the 82nd, I guess, to a degree. But again, they're Clydesdale, but again, I don't care if somebody can run with me. I'm not sure I even care if they can pass the PT test as it was back in the day when you had age points and all this stuff. What mattered to me is what is their strategic judgment? Can they look out 6 months from now and say, this is where we should be, or this is where we should be, and it proves valid? That's what really matters, because that is the quality that enables the strategic leader, and then the ones, again, at very senior levels in particular, that are making huge decisions as well for very large organizations, subordinate to the overarching strategic leader. Again, can they get the big ideas right? And that's really what it comes down to. It's really helpful if the individual can communicate effectively in writing, orally, briefings, and so forth. That's really helpful. And they can think and again, distill these ideas. The counterinsurgency guidance, for example, that we issued during my time in Iraq, about every month and a half or so, I'd hit the send key and it would have the latest tweaks to it. Can they provide inspiration, energy, example, good judgment, and good people, hang on to them, inspire them, make the decisions to let others go home earlier than they might have thought, ratchet the metrics down. I mean, that's an art in itself. Identify which metrics, the battle rhythm determination. Again, we had a huge butcher block piece of paper that laid out in very considerable detail what I did every single day of the week, what we did several times a week, twice a week, once a week, every other week, monthly, quarterly, and so on. Foster a learning culture, the right culture, again, for this. All of these different qualities, those are all great. And again, sit down and determine how to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. But it really comes down to the fundamental decisions on the strategy. And again, that stuff doesn't always follow. We had a flawed strategy from the beginning in Vietnam. The Vietnamese came to us and said, we got a problem in the villages and hamlets. We really need to have focus there. Could you help us with that? We said, That's sort of little stuff. You need to focus on the invasion across the demilitarized zone. We're just coming from Korea. That's what you need to worry about. So we're going to help you build 8 divisions that look exactly like ours, and so forth, even with the same equipment, even though the physical stature was much less. And we're going to fight a big war. And when we bring our units in, of course, the effects were fairly ephemeral. But, again, you can kill as many North Vietnamese, but if they can replace them, as they could, and that was recognized far too late, you're not going to win a war of attrition. And the conduct of search and destroy and the almost indiscriminate use of air power, unobserved and direct fires, mad minutes, all the rest of this also created more enemies in many cases than it took off the battlefield, which is a flawed approach as well. In fact, I used to have a sign on the wall of the operations center staring at me in each of these 5 combat commands that asked a question: will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that was no, you're supposed to redo the operation, change how you're going to conduct it so that you get to yes. And if you can't get to yes, you're supposed to sit under a tree until the thought passes. So again, this is pretty important stuff, and yet we didn't get it right in this massive commitment that we had in South Vietnam.
General, you've mentioned just now and in your book, leadership and morale as well. And we are Project Europe. We would like to take advantage of you being here and of your vast experience. What is your advice for leaders? You led from the tactical up to the strategic level, and you are very familiar from the human domain perspective with different countries, continents, so on and so forth. What is your advice for leaders, military and government service leaders for Europe specifically, given what is going on in Ukraine and understanding in the great power dynamic between the US, China, and Russia, that Europe is an important theater? What is your advice to these leaders? Because one of the key differences is, you've mentioned development and our attitude towards leadership. It's a little bit different from country to country within our alliance and with our allies and partners.
This is a little bit American centric, and I'm getting some feedback from somewhere. This is a bit American centric, but of course one of the big ideas should really be to spend 2% of GDP on defense. That obviously undermines the willingness to do that, or the willingness to commit to NATO the way we traditionally have in the United States. And it's particularly an acute issue right now. It's just that the Munich Security Conference, as I've always been for dating back to when I was a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe in the mid to late 1980s, and went for the first time when it was a modest little gathering. There was no security. The rest of the hotel went on, and now it's of course become this industrial strength project. But it had a very different feel this year. The Europeans have never been more serious, and the Americans have never been less. I guess it would be united is really the only way to put it. When you have someone like Senator J.D. Vance, who refuses to meet Zelensky and goes to the Munich Security Conference just to say that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. I've never seen that before. That's not the Codell McCain that, I remembered and loved and so on. So again, and given that the U.S. is the linchpin, the cornerstone, the foundation, however you want to describe it, for NATO, without which NATO really isn't what it otherwise would be. The U.S. spends not just more than all of our other 31, soon to be 31 allies, and it spends more than twice as much as all of them together. It's 2 point something as much as all of them together. Yes, now it's not all for Europe, but it can be all for Europe, depending on how you have to deploy your forces. But the bottom line is that having been dual-hatted 3 times as a general officer alone, 1-star in Bosnia, 3-star the NATO training mission in Iraq, as well as the MNSTICI, the Multinational Security Transition Command, and then obviously Afghanistan, where you're both the COM ISAF and COM US 4A. again, the critical component of U.S., it's the foundation. And the way, particularly in coalition operations, the coalition commander has to understand the strengths and weaknesses or limitations of every element of the force, has to understand the caveats that every single nation has except for the U.S., everyone, and then has to compensate for those, typically with U.S. capabilities, providing a U.S. intelligence plug, often air medevac, often special operations of various types. I mean, there was a contingent in Afghanistan that could not conduct offensive operations. We worked around that. We provided them a company of 82nd Airborne Division paratroopers. They conducted the offensive operations, and this unit happily would go and rescue them very, very quickly, actually, if anything at all happened. And it worked out very, very nicely. But that you have to have that kind of arrangement. Well, without the U.S., and we saw this in Afghanistan, we only had 3,500 U.S. forces left at the end. There were more than double that from other coalition countries. But when the U.S. decided to pull out, they couldn't stay. And nor could, by the way, the 17,000 contractors that maintained the overly sophisticated helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft that we insisted on providing by buying American instead of continuing to buy the old Soviet or Russian or Eastern Bloc helicopters and systems, which the Afghans could actually maintain. So again, you know, those countries really have to step up, and they have been. EU just passed 50 billion euros of additional support for Ukraine, even as we wait for the $60 billion that is hung up in the House of Representatives, haven't been approved by the Senate. European countries individually are all doing various agreements with Ukraine that are quite heartening. So both in aggregate and then individually, all these countries are doing that. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, with whom I met during Munich, noted that 18 of 31 countries will meet the 2% this year, and that number continues to climb. But that's, I think, the single biggest issue. There's lots of other stuff that you can talk about when it comes to the military industrial base that needs really revival in a very substantial way. When you talk about NATO standardization and interoperability, when there's a variety of these other issues. But I think it really comes down to providing the resources that are so necessary for this, not just for their own countries, but just to ensure that the U.S. can't say, well, you guys aren't doing this and it's your neighborhood. Why should we do it? And that sentiment, of course, is worrisome in the United States and is being played on particularly by one part of one party on Capitol Hill.
No, thank you for that. I think the neo-isolationist streak that does exist in some parts of America is quite concerning. But I want to pull on a thread of this quality versus quantity. The amount of money you spend doesn't necessarily reflect the quality or the quantity that's required to meet an adversary and to prevail in a conflict. How are new or novel technologies kind of bolstering the strategic judgment that you say is number one in the minds of senior leaders to be successful, or how are those technologies, offsetting the advantages other adversaries might have in quantity? Is quality really going to do that?
Well, the old adage, you want as many great folks as you possibly can get. But yeah, I got it. And it's also, one of the soft truths, quality, not quantity, and humans, not et cetera.
Now you're speaking my language.
Look, the various tools that are being developed have long really helped. If I think back to Iraq, where you really started to see a massive breakthrough in intelligence fusion, where with the real-time regional gateway, we're literally collecting so much data, often in dissimilar data sets, that we could no longer push it back through the pipes to the US, where it used to be dealt with in federated analysis. And that was not possible anymore because there's just too much of it. We couldn't build the pipes fast enough to keep up with the data. So Keith Alexander, who was then the head of NSA, came out, my West Point classmate and good friend, and the decision was, let's build the storage capacity out here. I don't think we called it a cloud in those days, but that's what it was. And build the computing power out here. And then let's bring the analysts out here So we got literally another 1,000 intelligence analysts. And then we decided to bring the applications engineers out so that we could turn new apps. And we were doing it at record speed because, of course, there's nothing else to do in the war zone. You're not going downtown for dinner. Nobody's asking when you're coming home from work for dinner, and you don't drink. So the productivity was enormous. And all of a sudden, we could take all these dissimilar data sets and fuse and pull a digital needle out of a digital haystack. So that's an example of how this works. That's most significant in the manhunt business. But that, many, many other tools that are very, very useful. And I think increasingly AI will come to the fore here. Although I should also note, as we do in the book, that the biggest challenge with unmanned systems was manning them. Remember, it took about roughly 150 people to keep one unblinking eye in the sky. So that means multiple crews for there's one that's on station, there's one that's coming off, there's one that's flying out, depending on how far it is. But then beyond that, the people that maintain the communications architecture, the people that take them off in theater and then hand them off to the folks at Nellis or wherever the base is. Actually, it's a different base outside Las Vegas that fly them, payload operate them. It's the armaments people. It's the maintainers, but then it's all of the people that are exploiting and analyzing and, again, fusing the intelligence, translating it, et cetera, and then producing finished analysis. So, again, the challenge here wasn't the platforms. They were relatively inexpensive and still are. Even the Reapers are not that expensive compared with so many of the other platforms in the sky. It's all about the people that are required to run it. Now, I think, again, machine learning, and AI can replace some of those people and or augment them in the same way that we're seeing in a whole variety of use cases in the civilian sector. I mean, I'm also a personal venture capitalist, invested in about 28 different startups, many of them multiple rounds. And one of those is basically revolutionizing how call centers operate. So you go from a call, and they're usually lousy experiences. So you shift to text, which is what people are more comfortable with. Then the machine watches the text. It has to be well trained and so forth. And it learns. And after it watches about 1 million transactions, the machine can start to suggest at least the options for the reply to make the human more efficient and effective. Gradually, you start to replace the humans in the first response, second response, third response. And then over time, you're just gradually winnowing down the workforce as it is augmented by, or in some cases replaced by. So you can see that happen in a number of different use cases in the military as well. In fact, one of the races that is ongoing, I just did a piece, in fact, for Foreign Policy on Ukraine and, wither Ukraine, basically. And my answer is, it depends. And I list all the factors on which it depends: continued U.S. support, Ukraine coming to grips with its forced generation challenges and the whole conscription issues that it has to resolve very urgently. The average age of a soldier on the front lines in Ukraine is 42, not 18 to 23, as was the case in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's no unit rotation. People have been on the line for 2 years. All of these issues, these are very emotional. They're very challenging, but they have to be resolved. Then it's also relative to Russia being able to continue to recruit, train, and equip. We'll see if they can keep doing that with these outrageous enlistment bonuses and so forth, or is at some point do Russia's mothers and fathers and wives say, no, not my son, not my husband. It's also, though, a race for technology. And we've seen what technology can do, particularly the maritime drones, which were developed by and large by Ukraine. I think they had some anti-ship missiles given to them, but certainly the maritime drones they have developed, and they and the anti-ship missiles have taken out about 1/3 of the Black Sea fleet. And of course, they can't be replaced because of the Montrose Convention, no warships through the Bosphorus. So that's very significant. And they've actually forced the Russian Black Sea fleet, by and large, to withdraw from the occupied Crimea port of Sevastopol, which opens up the Western Black Sea so that they can export grain to countries in North Africa in particular, noting that 25% of the world's grain exports come from Ukraine traditionally, and they're crucial to food security in Egypt and a number of other countries in North Africa and the Sahel. That's technology, but Russia's racing on that as well. Max Boot, I think, has characterized the war in Ukraine most aptly when he says it is All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner, because you have aspects of World War I in the trenches and barbed wire and minefields and all the rest of this, massive quantities of artillery used. But then you see Cold War hardware, by and large, what we had again in the late 1980s when I was privileged to be a brigade and battalion operations officer in Germany. And then you see cutting edge. On top of all of this, you have fairly cutting edge drones of various type, including first person view, essentially suicide drones that are proliferating. And both sides are developing these, in some cases buying them from other countries as well. That's a real race, and that could transform how war is conducted there if one side can get a sufficient advantage in that regard and a sufficient number of them, and the other side's air defenses are inadequate for dealing with them. So once again, this technology component is really very, very important. And I think it's going to be even more so in the years that lie ahead, not just in major conventional wars or deterrence of them, in which we are going to have to transform from, very simplistically put, but a small number of large platforms to a massive number of smaller unmanned systems, which increasingly will not be remotely piloted, but algorithmically driven. But that is going to affect irregular warfare as well, as it did during the surge in Iraq in particular, as the number of predators and other unmanned systems proliferated. And the same thing in Afghanistan, where you have towers with optics, blimps with optics, drones with optics. You just keep building this. And if you can build it out sufficiently, you can see an awful lot depending on the terrain, the vegetation, et cetera. So big advances ongoing. We're seeing to some degree a laboratory for this in Ukraine. And noting, of course, that Ukraine is not really, it wouldn't be characterized as an irregular warfare campaign. It's a conventional warfight by and large, although there are components of irregular warfare ongoing, but they're not by any means remotely the most important elements in that particular war.
No, thank you.
Great. We thank you for that. That you made a great point about AI and information and how that will impact the battlefield. I wanted to ask a two-pronged question on information domain elevation. You talk about that in your book as well. How should, going forward, content producers and consumers change their relationship to information in order to ensure that they do have a competitive advantage in a conflict? And what different approaches should different nations take in regulating and verifying said information? Because in addition to AI and technology, information, I think, is that particular weapon, shall we say, that is very efficient both in technology and the human domain.
Well, I think it's recognize here that Ukraine is unique in that there's never been so much transparency on a particular battlefield. And that's a result of the ubiquitous presence of smartphones, internet access, and social media platforms onto which you can upload videos, statements, photos, and so forth. And that means that open source intelligence is all out there. And if you can have tools that aggregate it, and they exist, and I actually subscribe to some of these, or organizations like the Institute for the Study of War, on whose board I sit, and where you have the Petraeus Center, you can, at an unclassified level, have incredible insights into what is going on. So that's the reality of this particular battlefield. And I think by and large, future battlefields, unless again you lose the ubiquitous access to the internet that you have actually in Ukraine, despite outages, despite challenges, etc. But it's also the first war, major war, in which you have social media to contend with. And that creates an enormous challenge. I'll illustrate this. In Iraq, during the surge, we actually hired a political campaign organization from the UK to augment our normal public affairs team, which was very considerable. But basically, between all those elements, someone was watching every TV channel relevant to Iraq, reading every newspaper online or hard copy, and looking at all social media such as they were at that time, noting that it's nothing remotely like what it is now, and responding to it. So this is, again, what you do in a political war room. If you see something outrageous, you immediately counter that. And we also had the big idea for dealing with the press there. First was, so there's a whole series, I had a whole briefing on this. The first slide of which was, you can't win if you don't play. And it had all these happy things about, here's Petraeus on the cover of Time or Newsweek or what have you. And it's sort of nice and helpful because you need a face of the war. Then it's, you can't lose if you don't play. And there's some that didn't go quite so well. Like the time I told a Washington Post reporter as a 2-star general, after reopening an international border in this incredible, 2-mile line, convoy trucks putting goods into the Mosul marketplace before we're going to pay salaries, which otherwise would have just driven up prices. And the Post reporter asked me what it felt like. It was so amazing to restore international border and restore life to Western Nainawa province in northwestern Iraq, et cetera. And I said, incredible. It's sort of like a cross between the Pope and the president. What was on the front page of the Washington Post the next day above the fold. And so you can't lose if you don't play, but you got to play and you have to be accessible. There's no, the old adage that, when dealing with the press, never pass up the opportunity to keep your mouth shut is a loser. So you do have to participate. And then the big idea was be first with the truth. We want to beat the bad guys to the headline, but we're going to do it with cold, hard facts and truth, not spin, not putting lipstick on pigs or any of this stuff. So again, you have to even have big ideas for that kind of stuff. And then of course you have to develop them into smaller ideas and how you actually apply them, how you operationalize the big ideas. But the task nowadays, when it comes to responding to all social media, is so vast as to be really, really challenging. And you also have an increase in the landscape, particularly in the US, where certain news outlets are very clearly in the camp of one political party or political candidate or figure than others. I go on all press. So I do everything from MSNBC, CNN, Fox, News Nation, Newsmax, all of them, because I think they should hear. And because I'm not politically affiliated and don't even register to vote, it is helpful. But the views are very, very different. I mean, there's no question about the orientation of certain of these networks, and that is a major challenge. So you've got that to contend with as well. So the landscape is vastly different. You still have to play, you still have to respond, but the magnitude of the challenge to do that is just incomparably greater.
No, thanks. It sounds like it. And it sounds like there's this this tension in this post-truth world where just because you're the first to the facts and you can present your case, that people might not believe you.
Yeah.
So is the response to that regulating those who are publishing disinformation, misinformation, or is it educating those who are consuming this information?
I mean, it can be both, but it depends on the entity. Is it the country, the EU? Various European countries do this reasonably well, I think. The EU, in certain respects, as a body, has a bit of an approach in that regard. It's very different in the US. We sort of go back and forth between just allowing all voices to be unfiltered and accessible, as has much greater the situation with Twitter, now X. And in fact, there are legal cases of very, very considerable importance that could undo the limited ability of various social media platforms to fact check, to challenge, to not post if it is just clearly wrong, dishonest, anti-science, whatever it may be. And that there's a case right now before the Supreme Court. It looks as if they are not going to go down the road of just preventing platforms from doing that. But it's a close run thing.
No, it's great. I think like organizations like Bellingcat or these open source fact checkers absolutely kind of put out the message that they can find. Have you found that content producers or have changed their relationship with information? And have you found that any different approaches that nations take in regulating or verifying the information have been successful or unsuccessful?
There are different approaches. Some are much more effective than others. The U.S. is, again, a little bit chaotic on that right now. It even varies by state. Florida is sort of notable for certain approaches that derive from the political tendencies or political concepts of the major leaders. And so it varies, California different, New York, et cetera. So again, it's really about understanding the ecosystem in which you're operating and then trying to do the very best that you can to respond to allegations, respond to untruths, respond to all of this, noting again that the challenge is incomparably greater than it was just 15 years ago.
But very helpful to come back to how you started with the big idea and communicating it properly, both to the military, to your to the force, as well as to the public, which is something that is very challenging in Europe, considering there's different countries and different, as you said, the understanding the human domain and the ecosystem is very important.
Well, yeah, countries, and we've run into this because, again, Axel Springer, as is known, again, we have the largest interest in Axel Springer of any investor, and the landscape in Hungary is very different from the landscape in, say, Germany, or the landscape. I mean, Hungary has constrained quite considerably press activities, essentially freedom of the press, freedom of expression to a degree. Poland had that challenge until the election of the new government and the new prime minister and cabinet. These are not trivial issues, by the way. These actually are issues that we look at when we're making investments, because again, without getting into some of the details, there can be problems with this, especially if you're in the media space, especially, and we had a huge investment, the United Group, which was active in all the former Yugoslavia countries in the Balkans. And each country there, we had issues in a variety of different ways, not all just with the media channels or outlets, but also with the ability to, just string cable and telephone lines, this kind of thing, telephone poles. And you'd have to go in and resolve those. And one of my jobs, in fact, in that particular investment was to solve these challenges, resolve the issues. And we were able to do so, by the way. We sold what we bought at 1.5, actually at $2 billion. So it was a very successful investment, but it was also a very challenging investment. And it laid out the landscape that we're talking about here, which varies, as you know, from country to country.
No, thanks, sir. One of the kind of points of the book that you make is the domains in which we are fighting or have conflict are actually expanding. But the information domain has been consistent, really, for a long time. Since the beginning of conflict. Has the importance of the information domain increased at all because of these technologies and the transparency in the battlefield you're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's both the importance and the complexity has dramatically changed. As I mentioned, again, just the sheer proliferation of different news media, different social media, and then even within that, you can get into WhatsApp groups and other groups. And so again, and how do you address all of these? How do you get into them? These are not trivial issues. And if what is being put out in these groups inflames a particular segment of society, then you got a real problem on your hands. And you're going to be in irregular warfare pretty quickly. if again, you can't figure out how to contend with these different forces. So I think it's just much, much more challenging. I think it's just much more complex than it ever was in the past.
No, that's great. I think that speaking of the irregular warfare, and like I know the DoD has put out a new definition of irregular warfare, which you can look up in the August 2023 Joint Pub. And it seems like different nations have their own interpretation of irregular warfare. Can you describe irregular warfare the way you see it, and if it has changed since 1945, really in the context of the book that you wrote?
Yeah, I think, again, irregular warfare, general war among the people and so forth is the real distinction. And it really comes down to getting the campaign design right and recognizing, again, what that should be rather than what you'd like it to be. And as I illustrated or described already, we pretty abysmal failure at that in Vietnam for 13 years. Don't get me wrong. Yes, there was a strategic Hamlet program. Yes, the Marines actually were doing it right. They actually had the right big ideas, which the overall commander derided. He wanted them actually to assemble back up and get out of the villages and get back into the jungle and thrash around and find the big enemy. Whereas if you're in the villages, the enemy has to come to you because they want what is in the villages, which is support, recruits, rice, sanctuaries, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think the common feature is to understand the nature of the particular conflict, and they're all slightly different in a variety of different ways. Afghanistan was not Iraq. I actually laid that out for Secretary Rumsfeld. When I came home from the 3-star tour in Iraq, he asked me to come home through Afghanistan and to do an assessment. And the very first slide was titled, "Afghanistan does not equal Iraq," and laid out a compare and contrast, and why my bottom line was that Afghanistan was going to be the longest of the long wars. And it was, because it was much, much more challenging in a variety of different ways, with the sanctuaries, lack of money, lack of education, lack of infrastructure, serious terrain, neighbors that were very unhelpful. All of these different features made it incomparably more difficult, even if you got the big ideas right, which again, it took us, and the inputs, it took us 9 years to do that after a brilliant initial campaign to topple the Taliban and eliminate the al-Qaeda sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan, at the least, where the 9/11 attacks were conducted. So understanding again how this is all evolved, and understanding the importance of a new domain of warfare, if you will, informational, cyberspace, outer space, all of these, I think, is particularly important. But there have been a lot of commonalities over the years as well. I would submit, just quickly, if we look at the Middle East right now, that I would contend that the campaign for Gaza should be more of a counterinsurgency campaign than a conventional military campaign, because it is a war among the people. So this should be more of an irregular warfare campaign. I agree with the imperative of destroying Hamas, but how you do that really matters. And if you're not adhering to the test question about does it create more bad guys and it takes off the street, then you're creating problems down the road. But you do need to render them incapable of accomplishing their mission without reconstitution, which is the doctrinal definition of destroy. Yes, you have to dismantle the political wing. It can never run Gaza again. Got to get the hostages back. But there should be a vision for the people, such as we provided before our major urban operations, such as Ramadi, Fallujah, Baquba, Mosul, large parts of Baghdad, where we laid out, we want to separate you from the bad guys. We're going to create 12 gated communities within Fallujah to enable us to do this. We're going to have biometric ID cards. You lay it all out. We're going to keep the hospital open because we want to control it and ensure that it can take care of civilians who we mistakenly injure. We're going to make your lives better. And I haven't seen that particular component of this, although I think there's a growing awareness of this. And beyond that, of course, if it's a counterinsurgency campaign, you clear, hold, and build. You don't clear and move on. And that hold is crucial because that's what keeps the enemy from reconstituting. And we learned that the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you think of as late as 2006, in response to the spiraling, the escalating violence that resulted from the summer mosque bombing in 22 February 2006, that set off the cycle of sectarian violence and took it to terrifying levels. Again, a real civil war at that time. In that fall, we conducted 2 major operations in Baghdad that drove violence down very clearly. You can look at the slides. You know, I have these almost memorized, and you see a big drop, and that was Operation Together Forward 1. And then it goes back up again. Why did it go back up? Because we cleared and handed off rather than cleared and held. And then there's another drop off. It's Operation Together Forward 2. And we did the same thing. So the effect was quite ephemeral, as was, frankly, the effect of most of the major operations in Vietnam, where, again, there was no hold plan out there. And so the enemy would be back as soon as you left. So, again, looking at campaign design is really it's, again, the big idea. What is the nature of this war? And therefore, what should the nature of our strategy be? And that's, again, the biggest of the takeaways for any kind of war. But I think it's particularly true for irregular warfare, because if you don't get that right, if you don't understand that, you're not going to accomplish your objectives.
No, thank you very much. I want to just say thank you. And there's a risk there of analysis paralysis before actually acting, which we can get into later. But I think Olga's got final questions and closing. Really appreciate your time today, sir. Thank you.
You bet.
Yes, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, General. And one thing that wasn't mentioned was I think you have, though, the word history. You've given us a few history lessons along this very, very insightful dialogue. And that brings it all together, I think, to the big picture. Because the big picture, understanding the operation, the strategy, constructing a very healthy operational design, getting the big idea right, and then making it operational, understanding the technological aspect of things and being active and pursuing that, getting in front of everyone as much as possible, encouraging innovation in science, but also understanding the human terrain and the way that allies, partners, and different groups interact with each other, and history. And that, I think, brought it all together with the way you see irregular warfare. We thank you very much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure. And the book, thank you for bringing all these ideas to Project Europe. And I recommend for everyone to get the book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Obviously, shameless plug for the Irregular Warfare Initiative and Project Europe. Follow us on social media, X, formerly known as Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And we look forward to see everyone March 5th at 10 a.m. Eastern for our next fireside chat with when we'll talk about the role of SOF in IW with Lieutenant General Ken Tobo. Thank you very much, General Petraeus. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye.